Good afternoon. Thank you for viewing today's webinar, Centering the Margins, Understanding and Supporting Graduate Student Mental Health and Belonging. This presentation was one of your favorites from the 2025 annual conference. My name is Dr. Hilda Billups, and I currently serve as the Director of the Webinars Committee for TACUSPA. Allow me to introduce our speaker for today's webinar. Dr. Lauren S. Carter is a student affairs leader, educator, and well-being advocate with over a decade of experience supporting students, faculty, and staff in higher education. She currently serves as the director of the Center for Academic Performance at the University of North Texas Health Science Center, where she leads institution-wide initiatives focused on academic success, holistic support, and sustainable well-being. Dr. Carter's work centers on the unique pressures faced by those in helping professions, including burnout, belonging, and role strain. She regularly partners with faculty, administrators, and student support teams to design strengths-based, future-focused strategies promoting holistic well-being in demanding academic and professional environments. In addition to her work in higher education, Dr. Carter is a co-founder of Watercress Rising, an Oklahoma-based nonprofit committed to culturally responsive education, community wellness, and youth empowerment. Through her special projects, she integrates media, storytelling, education, and care-centered leadership to foster healing, belonging, and joy. We're very thankful and excited to have Dr. Carter share with us today.
Thank you, Dr. Billups. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with today's participants. But again, thank you so much to you as well as the TACUSPA webinar team for inviting me back to present. It truly means a great deal to me to know, excuse me, that this presentation resonated with attendees at the annual conference, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to continue this conversation. Today's presentation is based on my doctoral dissertation, which explored the experiences of BIPOC graduate students and the factors influencing their mental health and well-being. Throughout our time together, I'll share research findings, participant stories, and practical strategies for supporting graduate students. While this study focused on one specific population, my hope is that the lessons we discussed today encourage all of us to think more intentionally about how we create environments where graduate students feel connected, supported, and that they're able to thrive. Before we explore the findings, I'd like to share a little bit more about myself and share why this work became important to me. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So people often ask how I became interested in graduate student mental health. And the answer is quite simple. Long before I decided to pursue my doctorate, I spent years working alongside students in residence life and in student affairs. So shout out to all of my Swakuho people. Again and again, I continue to just meet incredibly talented students who weren't struggling because they lacked ability. They were navigating competing responsibilities and obligations. So there was questions of belonging, there was financial pressure, there was family obligations, and the everyday realities of life outside of the classroom. I like to say, and I feel like this resonates with a lot of us in student affairs, and that is life doesn't stop just because you're in school, especially grad school. And so eventually, from these conversations, I started to think about questions that I wanted to explore through my dissertation. And one of the things I appreciate most about qualitative research is that it reminds us that there are real people behind every data point. So throughout today's presentation, you'll hear themes that emerge from the study, but more importantly, you'll hear the voices of the participants themselves, because their stories truly are the heart of the work that we do every day. So as we move through today's webinar, my goal is not simply to present research. My hope is that you'll leave with practical ideas you can apply within your own institutional context. So let's begin looking at the current landscape and why conversations like this continue to matter. So graduate education is often viewed as the pathway toward leadership, expertise, and professional advancement. At the same time, it can also be one of the most demanding seasons in a student's life. Participants in this study describe navigating rigorous academic expectations alongside financial responsibilities, family obligations again, and as I mentioned previously, questions of belonging and significant life transitions. Their experiences remind us that graduate education rarely occurs in isolation from everything else that's happening in a student's life. And that's where the title of this presentation comes from, Centering the Margins. For me, centering the margins means intentionally including graduate student perspectives when designing programs and services and systems that support student success. So rather than viewing graduate students as an afterthought, we create opportunities to better understand their experiences and ensure they remain a part of the conversation. Something that happened for me throughout my time in higher ed, especially going from a predominantly undergraduate institution to a graduate health professional school, is there was this misconception that these students didn't need, the same help. And parts of that was true. They didn't need necessarily the same type of help that students get in undergrad, but they still needed help. It just looked different. And so, as many of us know, higher education continues to evolve in response to legislative and institutional changes, and student professionals across Texas and beyond are adapting to their work within those realities while remaining committed to supporting student success. And although the context continues to change, graduate students, their needs related to mental health, belonging, and academic success, that remains. And so the opportunity before us is to continue supporting students in ways that are thoughtful, effective, and aligned with our institutional environments. Now, graduate students, as I mentioned, are sometimes overlooked in our conversations because they often appear independent and academically successful. Yet, research consistently tells us that they experience high levels of stress, anxiety, and burnout while frequently accessing support services less often than our graduate students. And that's what makes this conversation particularly important. And so, with that in mind, I'd like to briefly explain how this study was designed before we explore what those participants shared. So, the purpose of this study was to better understand how students describe their graduate school experiences and how those experiences influence their mental health, well being, and academic success. I intentionally chose a qualitative, phenomenological narrative approach because I wasn't looking for averages or percentages. I love stories. I wanted to understand lived experiences through the voices of the participants themselves. And so this study was guided by two theoretical frameworks, intersectionality theory and the equity and mental health framework. Together, these frameworks provided a lens for understanding how students' identities and institutional environments shape their experiences throughout graduate school. And after completing the interviews, I conducted multiple rounds of qualitative coding, allowing themes to emerge naturally from participants' narratives. And 5 research questions ultimately guided the findings that we'll discuss today. So let me introduce real quick a snapshot of the individuals whose stories shaped this study. So the study included 10 graduate students representing master's, doctoral, and professional degree programs across 5 states and multiple institution types. Participants also represented a variety of life experiences. Some were working professionals, others were full-time students. Several balanced caregiving responsibilities alongside graduate school, and every participant held 2 or more intersecting identities, allowing the study to capture a rich range of experiences. Now, to protect confidentiality, all participants' names that you'll hear throughout today's presentations are pseudonyms. So, as we move through each research question, I'd encourage you to listen for the themes and also just the people behind those themes. And although each story is unique, together they paint a really powerful picture of what graduate education can look like and feel like for many of the students that we work with day to day. So let's begin with the first question. How do participants describe their graduate student experience? So before beginning this study, I expected participants to talk primarily about the coursework, the research, and the academic expectations. While those experiences certainly appeared throughout the interview, I found myself hearing something a little bit more deeper. Participants described graduate school as a process of transition. They weren't simply learning new content or completing assignments. They were learning new expectations. They were navigating unfamiliar environments. They were building professional identities, some that were new and unique to them. And they were trying to determine where they fit within those spaces. And so one of the participants shared, a quote, I felt like I was carrying the burden of proving I belonged. And that statement, again, it stayed with me because it wasn't really about intelligence. It wasn't about grades. It was simply about belonging. There was a participant who her name was Jennifer. Her story reflected many of these transitions that you see here listed on the screen. She described beginning her doctoral program just before COVID-19, before the height of the pandemic dramatically changed higher education. And what might have already been a significant adjustment became even more complex as she navigated graduate school during what, we all know was unprecedented times, especially as it relates to uncertainty. And so at the same time that participants are describing, the things that they would traditionally experience during a graduate program, they're also navigating these life experiences that I think we all can say hit us really hard. Um, but they were also adding this rigorous academic program on top of it. They also spoke about professional growth, discovering new strengths, and finding encouragement through mentors and colleagues and supportive communities. One of the strongest findings from this study is that community didn't eliminate difficult experiences. It just often made those experiences feel more manageable. Graduate students don't simply transition into new academic expectations, they're transitioning into new identities. And so having a group that can go through that with you, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything that you're experiencing itself is now easy. It means that you have a group that makes it digestible because it's a collective shared experience that other people can relate to. And it's my belief that student affairs can play an important role in helping students navigate what this looks like. Now, if graduate school shapes students' experience in this way, the next question then becomes, how do those experiences impact or influence their mental health and their well-being? And so the second research question explored this. And it's probably not surprising that the participants describe graduate school as stressful. Graduate education is demanding by design. What surprised me, however, was how often participants question themselves even while succeeding academically. One participant shared, I questioned if I was good enough, even when my grades said otherwise. And that quote captures something many student affairs professionals encounter, but may not always see. Confidence and confidence and competence don't always develop at the same pace, right? And so I had a participant named Kamala that her story illustrated this particularly well. She described entering graduate school feeling excited and curious, but quickly reaching a point where she just felt she went from being curious to fatigue fairly quickly. And rather than stopping there, she also described learning to establish new routines, how she had to rely on colleagues and mentors and intentionally creating balance in her life. One of the things that she mentioned, and I see this often even with the students that I work with today, is you developed habits, whether intentionally or not, that get you to a certain point. And when that certain point is a graduate program, you've put in time and energy and have done things that allowed you to be very successful. However, once you step through that door, that is graduate education, a lot of times you have to change that. And that may mean changing everything, or the majority of the things that you've done that have gotten you to that point. It doesn't mean that you can't be successful, but it does mean that you now have to change everything that has been familiar to you. And so, what I appreciated about Kamala's story was that it reminds us that resilience isn't about avoiding challenges, it's about developing the skills and support systems needed to move through them. And so, other participants also decide, or related to this as well, they described academic pressure, imposter syndrome, and continuous skill development as important parts of their experience. These challenges influence not only how they view themselves academically, but also how they experience graduate school personally. And here's the thing. Graduate students who appear highly successful may still question whether they belong. Those moments are things that we have to get really intentional about how can we pull that information out of them. And so as participants described changes in their mental health, another important question emerged, and that was what happens academically when students begin struggling emotionally? And so, as I continued to analyze the interviews, one thing became increasingly clear. Participants didn't describe their mental health and academic performance as separate experiences. They consistently described them as being deeply interconnected. And so, the third question explored how participants believed their mental health influenced their academic success. And you'll see here one of my favorite quotes from those interviews because I think it truly captures it all. They said, when my mental health declined, my performance followed. It's a simple statement, but it captures an important reality. Participants weren't describing a lack of motivation or ability. They were describing how stress and anxiety and grief and emotional exhaustion influenced their concentration, their productivity, as well as their confidence. A participant by the name of Miguel. His story particularly stood out to me as it related to this research question. Rather than saying he was failing academically, he reflected on how he would submit work, sometimes that didn't represent the standard he expected of himself. He recognized that his mental health had begun to influence the quality of his work long before anyone else noticed. And that distinction matters. Sometimes declining grades are the first visible sign that something else is happening beneath the surface. And it doesn't necessarily mean when I say a declining grade that, like, oh, they go from being an A student to an F student. It could be a subtle change. But again, these students, especially a lot of graduate students, they're used to being top tier students. And so they're going to do the work, they're going to submit this assignment, but you may notice that there's just a change in what they are producing. And I think as student affairs professionals and even faculty, we often have an opportunity to ask what happened before assuming what's wrong, or that they just didn't prepare. Now, participants describe fluctuations in academic performance, difficulty maintaining focus, and setbacks during significant life events. Their stories remind us that academic success and mental well-being should never be viewed as competing priorities. And if mental health influences academic performance, the next question naturally becomes, where do students turn when they need support? And that is what the fourth question explored. One of the most interesting findings from this study was that awareness wasn't necessarily the challenge. Most participants knew resources existed, and some had even been exposed to well-being skills and strategies in their previous educational environment. The bigger question was whether those resources felt accessible, if they were relevant, and if they were responsive to their current experiences. One participant shared they didn't feel like the resources were made for students like them. And that statement isn't simply about counseling services, it was also about connections. There was a participant named Riri, and I really feel her story illustrated this beautifully because she spoke about the power of something as simple as a genuine check-in from a faculty or a staff member rather than focusing exclusively on formal services. During her interview, she reminded me that relationships often become that bridge that helps students access support, especially because Participants described the long wait times, the uncertainty around available services, and concerns about whether or not they would feel understood if they sought help. So, having those check ins provided a natural gateway that allowed students to just say, this is really how I'm doing, this is how I'm feeling, without them having to be the one to initiate that all the time. I really feel like these experiences remind us that effective support involves more than just providing resources. It also involves creating environments where students feel comfortable using them. And as participants reflected on available resources, they also described what they hoped universities would do differently. Which brings me to my final research question. And that was around, I essentially asked participants what role they felt universities should play in supporting graduate students' mental health and well-being. And I appreciated this question because participants weren't asking institutions to eliminate every challenge associated with graduate education. They understood that graduate school is rigorous and that it can often have periods where it's just hard. But instead, they described wanting environments that recognize them as whole people. One participant shared, the university should meet us where we are, not where they assume we are. And I think that quote really summarizes this entire study. A lot of times we make assumptions, and sometimes it is from our own experiences, be it as students or just things that we've seen other students navigate through. But I think it's really important to meet students where they are and find ways to get that information. And we'll explore that a little bit later on in the presentation. But one thing I did want to share was one of the participants' story. Her name was Jade, and her story especially stayed with me because she reminded me that it's important for people to know that she was a graduate student, but that she was a person navigating all parts of life, right? She was navigating relationships, she was navigating responsibilities, aspirations, and challenges that were outside of the classroom, but did have the ability to impact what was going on in the classroom. And so throughout the interviews, this was common. Participants consistently described the importance of normalizing conversations about mental health, increasing accessibility, but also creating support that reflected the realities of graduate student life. Ultimately, they weren't asking institutions to do everything, but they were asking institutions to create opportunities where they could listen to them. And I believe that was an important distinction. As I reflect on these findings, I still to this day continue to ask myself questions about this. But I think this study is the reason why I started asking myself a different question. And that is, if these are the experiences graduate students are describing, what can institutions realistically do and quickly? So there are 5 lessons that I would love to share with you. I realized the findings weren't simply describing graduate student experiences, they were also offering important lessons for those of us who serve students every single day. The first lesson is that graduate student success and well-being cannot be separated. Participants consistently described how their emotional well-being influenced their academic experience and vice versa. Second, belonging cannot be assumed. Students may appear engaged academically while still questioning whether they truly fit within their programs or institutional communities. And third, support should be proactive rather than reactive. Waiting until a student reaches crisis often means we've missed an early opportunities to connect, encourage, and intervene. And fourth, trusting relationships matter just as much as available resources. Participants repeatedly emphasized the importance of faculty, staff, peers, and mentors who genuinely just took the time to know them and not just their field of study. Finally, small institutional changes can create meaningful student experiences. Not every improvement requires additional funding or an entirely new initiative. Sometimes the greatest impact comes from consistently demonstrated that students are seen, valued, and supported. And those lessons naturally led me to answering and really, I guess, more so asking another question. If these findings are true, what can institutions begin doing tomorrow? And that is what you see on this slide. One of the things that I appreciate most about student affairs is that we often incredibly create. We're just creative problem solvers. And throughout this presentation, we've talked about the challenges, but now I want to spend a few moments talking about opportunities. And so the recommendations on this slide intentionally focus on actions that are realistic, practical, and adaptable across different institutional contexts. So faculty. Faculty can normalize help seeking by incorporating regular check-ins, communicating with flexibility when appropriate, and creating learning environments where asking for support is viewed as a strength rather than a weakness. Student affairs professionals can continue developing graduate-specific programming, strengthening campus partnerships, and creating opportunities for graduate students to build meaningful connections. And when it comes to our institutional leaders, they also play an important role by thoughtfully thinking about how we can allocate resources, regularly reviewing policies, and assessing whether current practices are meeting students' evolving needs. None of these recommendations are revolutionary, but together they do contribute to a culture where graduate students feel recognized as people, not simply as students completing degree requirements. And that is significantly important. Meaningful change often begins with small, consistent actions, and these are just a couple that I wanted to share with you guys today. Now, as we think about graduate student success, I also believe it's worth considering how we define success in the first place. Higher education has traditionally measured success through outcomes like GPA, retention, and graduation. And those measures absolutely matter. But after listening to participants' stories, I found myself wondering if they're enough. We often want to find ways to add to those numbers. And some of the things that I think we can do is start asking questions and finding ways to measure whether students felt connected, whether they developed meaningful relationships, whether they knew where they could seek support, whether they experienced a genuine, excuse me, sense of belonging. Those experiences may not always appear on a dashboard, but they often influence every outcome we do measure. And so expanding how we think about student success doesn't require abandoning traditional metrics. It simply encourages us to recognize that academic outcomes are often strengthened when students also experience connection, community, and belonging and well-being. I believe that one of the most important lessons this study has to offer is that student success metrics tell us what happened. Student stories often influence us in getting a better understanding as to why things are happening. Now, I'd like to conclude by sharing one final story that brings many of these things together because during the presentation at Takuspa last year, I actually had a case study and there was a handout. And so there was an interactive component. You can call it the practitioner in me, but I like for things to be practical and meaningful and that we all have an experience together. But since we are doing this virtually, I'm going to talk you through a story and then just provide some prompts for you to think through. So as you're watching this, feel free to pause and ask yourself these questions after I read through it. But yeah, here's an activity that I'd like for you to think about. So as I mentioned, I'd like to start wrapping up by introducing you to a woman named Cree. Cree isn't one specific participant from the study. Instead, she is a composite of experiences shared across multiple interviews. Her story reflects many of the themes that I've shared today. And so, yeah, let's learn a little bit more about her. So, Cree is an Afro-Indigenous doctoral student pursuing a STEM degree. She's engaged, academically successful, and deeply committed to completing her program. At the same time, she's balancing financial pressures, family responsibilities, and uncertainty surrounding her mother's health. Since the closure of a graduate affinity group, she's also struggled to find meaningful connections and trusted mentorship within her program. Like many participants in this study, Cree's story reminds us that graduate students rarely experience academic challenges in a vacuum. Their identities, relationships, responsibilities, and environments all shape how they experience graduate education. Cree doesn't need someone to question whether she's capable. She's already demonstrated that. What she needs is an environment that recognizes her humanity alongside her academic potential. And that's the invitation I hope this presentation leaves all of you with. And here's the thing, every institution has a Cree. The question becomes whether she feels seen. So, as you think about Cree's story, I'd like to invite you to spend a few moments reflecting about your own campus. If Cree was at your institution, what what do you think it would take for her to not just be there and be successful, but to actually thrive? And so I'd encourage you to consider some of the questions, not only in relation to Cree, but also in relation to the graduate students you encounter every day. So, what needs in Cree's story already exist on your campus? Which of those needs could be addressed without creating an entirely new program? And perhaps most importantly, what is one small change you could influence within your own role this semester that would help a student like Cree be successful? One of the things I appreciate most about student affairs is that meaningful change often begins with seemingly ordinary moments, a check in, a referral, a conversation, a partnership, a policy reviewed through different lens. Those moments may seem small individually, but together they shape the culture students experience every day. And that brings me to one final question that I want to leave you with. And it kind of ties back to something that I mentioned earlier. Throughout today's webinar, we've explored research findings, participants' narratives, and practical strategies for supporting graduate students. But if there's only one idea I hope that stays with you, it's this. Every policy, every process, and every interaction communicates something to students about whether they know or whether they belong, excuse me. And the final question that I have for you is, what assumptions are you making about graduate students that you've never actually asked them? I think that's one of the greatest gifts of qualitative research. It invites us to replace assumptions with curiosity, to replace quick answers with genuine listening, and to remember that before students become data points, retention statistics, or graduation rates, they're people. And I hope these stories encourage you to continue asking thoughtful questions, that you listen with intention, and that you create environments where graduate students feel seen, heard, valued, and empowered to thrive. Because, quite frankly, listening is one of the most powerful interventions that we have. So I want to thank you for allowing me to share this study with you. And with that, I am going to pass it back to Dr. Billups.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carter, for sharing with us today. And thank you for viewing this webinar. Please visit our YouTube channel for more webinars like this one, as well as recordings of our other webinar types. If you missed a webinar this year, we invite you to watch the recording. If you're interested in presenting, serving as a panelist for a future webinar Wednesday, or participating in a pre-recorded webinar, please consider completing the proposal form. The link will be included in the description for this video. Registration is open for our 2026 annual conference. Presentations like this one will be highlighted. This year's theme is Leading Through Change. Please visit our website to register. Finally, the TACUSPA membership year runs from January to December. If you're not yet a member of TACUSPA, we invite you to join us. Thank you and have a great day.